Hello and welcome to part 2, mini documentary number 2, continuing to look at bowing. In the first session we looked at establishing a relaxed bow hold, and now I'd like to talk about starting to move the bow. Often, as I said in the previous video, people do either too much or too little with the bow hand and the bow arm, and by that I mean that quite often the wrist is either rigid and really tense, and that results in a very hard sound. It often makes a scratchy sound and makes playing legato very difficult. Or players move the wrist quite dramatically in order to change the bow. So they'll get to the end of a bow stroke and then flick the wrist in and out. And the result of that is often a sort of exaggerated swell right at the end of a bow stroke. And that's something that's not necessarily what you want all the time. It can be quite an ugly sound. The way I approach this, and again this is just my opinion, it's not the right way, what I prefer is to have a wrist that is almost inactive, a wrist that is essentially just passive the whole time. We talked in the last video about having a very, very relaxed hand such that it's a bit like a dead fish flapping at the end of your arm. And I think what happens is that a lot of students or amateur players look at professional players and they see a lot of movement like this and they think, okay, so they are changing the bow by moving the wrist. But I think a lot of the time what's actually happening is that they are interpreting the passive movement of the wrist as a deliberate flicking motion or bending motion. If the wrist is nice and relaxed, then what happens is it acts as a buffer between bow strokes. So if I do a push bow and then turn it into a pull bow, you can see that my wrist is moving at the end of each bow stroke, but that movement is entirely passive. It's a little bit like the bristles of a paintbrush. If you imagine the wrist and the hand as the bristles and the forearm as the stick, then the stick, when you paint a line of paint along a piece of paper with a brush, the only part that is under your control, your direct control, is the stick. That's the bit you're holding and moving. The bristles move by themselves. You don't move the bristles. The bristles are passive. So if you put the bristles on, you move the stick, you change direction, and the bristles change direction after the arm has changed its direction. They move passively. It's the same with the wrist. So again, if I play on my bow, if I play a push bow, I'm moving the arm, and the note is starting on my forearm with a push bow, and my wrist follows it. And then if I was to do a push bow into a pull bow, again, I start the push bow with my forearm, the inside of my forearm, and then when I get into the pull bow, the note is started by the outside of my forearm, and the wrist follows that. It doesn't lead, it doesn't flick, I'm not moving it deliberately. Any movement you see is just passive. That's the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Stay tuned for the next one. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting or useful, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons just below the video. And you can visit my website, samstadlen.co.uk, for more information. There's a link in the description below. If you'd like to suggest any more subjects for tutorial videos, I'd really welcome your suggestions, and you can write them in the comments below. Thanks, and see you in the next one.